cervix. So that is invasive endocervical adenocarcinoma and also adeno in situ. Considering the two together because I think the distinction is a difficult one and probably a little subtle for us at this stage. This is what I would consider a classic appearance of adenocarcinoma in situ, and it is, as you can see, quite a crowded group of endocervical cells. They're flat, it's still recognisably endocervical. Notice there's columnar shapes there, but if you look in this larger group, they're very crowded. So this is what we would call a drunken honeycomb, where the nuclei are leaning up against each other and too close, really. Similar here, that's a really good example of it. Notice the chromatin's quite coarse, they're very hyperchromatic, and they do vary, but they're all really have a fairly smooth nuclear membrane and are round or oval. Bit of margination of the chromatin onto the membrane, but it's not really indented heavily. This is typical too, a really crowded hyperchromatic group. We must look at these, they're either HiSil or something else. Bit hard to see here, but you can at this power see that again they're all nice and round, and if I focus up and down that middle, it's a bit dark, but I shouldn't be able to see through more than a couple of cells deep, and that's a key difference with HiSil, where you have a central piling of the nuclei that are often 3 or 4 layers deep. Around the outside, maybe I can make out some elongate columnar shapes, but this is a fairly difficult differential from squamous. This one's more obviously glandular, I think. So the cell down the bottom there is looking columnar, and I can see other areas that are more columnar. It's still flat, and I can make out a crowded honeycomb in that. Another crowded hyperchromatic group, again quite round nuclei. Can't actually see a palisading around the outside of this group, but it does have a hint of columnar shape to it, especially down there at about 4 o'clock. And around here, and again I'd be looking for limited depth of focus. Notice how round the nuclei are, and the chromatin is finer than HiSil. Another example here, again bringing the nuclei into focus. They're hyperchromatic, but the chromatin's quite fine, so not large chunks of it. Limited depth of focus, so probably 1 to 2 cells deep. There is a columnar shape to that cell there, and I can see little nucleoli in most of the nuclei. So we see those in HiSil, but not nearly as frequently as in AIS. And up this top area it has that delicate glandular cytoplasm that is finely granular. Another crowded hyperchromatic group, and similar findings really, very hyperchromatic nuclei. Again, this is a bit hard to discriminate from high-grade cell. I would be looking probably at other groups that show more obvious glandular architecture, but I can see there's quite round nuclei. Here's a group, and I can see good columnar shape in these, so I can bring a honeycomb into focus, and also the palisading end up there. Notice how sometimes the nuclei become cigar shaped in these columnar cells. A good honeycomb in the middle of this group, that's quite hard to see into, but I can tell that it's a crowded honeycomb pattern, so a drunken honeycomb if you like. Again, elongate cells coming off the side of the group, and this area up here is showing what we call a strip. So this is like a palisading or pseudo-stratified palisade of abnormal endocervical cells. So that's a good hint for me that this is not squamous. Another feature you might see a bit is lots of goblet cells like this, and in fact there is one type of endocervical adenocarcinoma that is intestinal in type, and so it's characterized by many large goblet cell type vacuoles. So in summary, what I want to see to diagnose endocervical adeno or adeno in situ is glandular arrangement, so the architecture should reflect the glandular differentiation. So we see crowded hyperchromatic groups, but often they have limited depth of focus, one layer deep, and they show a very, very crowded basic honeycomb. And you will see pseudostratified strips, as we just looked at as well. The cytoplasm should be glandular, so it should be less dense than squamous cells. It should have a less well-defined border, and it should be granular, indicating very small vacuoles, or else have large mucinous goblet cell vacuoles. The cells should be configured like columnar cells with an eccentric nucleus, and sometimes you see a bit of feathering out from the groups, indicating the long tails of the nuclei of the cells sticking out from those groups. Nuclei are generally enlarged, quite hyperchromatic, and variable in size, but still retain a nice round oval nucleus, usually with quite a regular nuclear membrane, and the chromatin, although dark, is usually quite fine. Nucleoli may be quite prominent sometimes, but they are a little variable, but probably more commonly seen than in high cell. There's a number of benign conditions that can mimic high-grade glandular neoplasia and invasive cancer, but we're not going to go into those today. More common is something squamous or is it glandular? It's easy to work out it's high grade, but harder to work out the differentiation. And the key clues to that really are looking for architectural clues. So do the cell groups have no central piling? That's typical of crowded hyperchromatic groups seen in high-grade SIL really. And does it have other features of glandular architecture? So maybe a hint of a honeycomb, palisading, pseudostratified strips, maybe a bit of feathering of elongate cells out from the groups. And then in terms of nuclei, generally these are more uniform and the chromatin is not as coarse as it is in a high-grade SIL. The nuclear membranes tend to be less irregular, indented, than are seen in high SIL. And it's variable, but nucleoli are generally more commonly seen in glandular lesions.